The worst kind of heartbreak is not when someone leaves you, but when they make you feel invisible while standing right beside you. My name is Emily Carter, and I never thought the most important day of my life would become the moment I finally understood where I truly stood in my own family. It was my wedding day in a quiet suburban venue outside Denver, Colorado, the kind of place decorated with soft white flowers, warm lighting, and carefully arranged chairs that were supposed to represent celebration, unity, and new beginnings. He had imagined this day for years, not just as a ceremony between me and the man I loved, but as a moment where my family would finally feel complete, where every relationship would settle into something peaceful and supportive. But from the moment I arrived that morning, something felt different in a way I could not immediately explain. My father, Robert Carter, was already there when I arrived, standing near the entrance with my sister, Jessica Carter, beside him. At first glance, it looked normal, even comforting, like a father preparing for his daughter's wedding. But the way his attention was divided between us felt uneven, subtle but unmistakable. Whenever Jessica spoke, he leaned in slightly, listening with focus and warmth. Whenever I approached, his responses were shorter, more distracted, as if I was part of the background rather than the center of the day. He told myself not to read too much into it. Weddings are stressful, and people behave differently under pressure. That is what I kept repeating in my mind as I moved through the preparation rooms, adjusting my dress, checking my hair, and trying to stay focused on the meaning of the day rather than small emotional disturbances. But as the ceremony time approached, the imbalance became harder to ignore. When guests began arriving, I noticed how often my father positioned himself closer to my sister when speaking with people, as if naturally drawn to her presence in a way that excluded me without any direct statement. Jessica looked composed and calm, smiling in a way that seemed effortless, while I was constantly aware of every interaction, every glance, every moment. That felt slightly misaligned. The wedding planner called for final preparations, and I stood for a moment alone near the entrance of the ceremony area, watching guests settle into their seats. That was when I first felt a quiet discomfort I could not fully name. It was not something obvious like conflict or argument. It was something more subtle, like being included in an event but not fully included in its emotional center. I remember thinking that perhaps I was simply anxious, that this was normal wedding day sensitivity, and that everything would feel different once the ceremony actually began. But even as I tried to ground myself in that thought, I saw my father speaking to Jessica again, this time with a familiarity that felt more natural than anything he had directed toward me that entire morning. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was just consistent enough to be noticed. And in that consistency, I began to sense a pattern forming that I did not yet fully understand. I told myself again that this was my wedding day, that I should focus on the future, not on small emotional impressions. But deep down, something in me had already started paying closer attention to what was being shown rather than what was being said. As the ceremony time moved closer, I began to notice that the emotional imbalance I had sensed earlier was not a coincidence or a product of wedding day anxiety, but something that was consistently reinforced through every interaction taking place around me. My name is Emily Carter, and I remember standing near the preparation area as guests continued to arrive, each moment making it harder to ignore the way attention was being distributed within my own family. My father, Robert Carter, remained close to my sister Jessica more often than he remained close to me, and it was not a dramatic or obvious separation, but a natural pattern that became more visible the longer I observed it. Whenever he spoke with her, his posture softened slightly, his attention remained uninterrupted, and there was a sense of familiarity in their interaction that did not seem to require effort. When he turned to me, however, the exchange felt shorter, more functional, as if the emotional weight of the day was being divided unevenly without anyone explicitly acknowledging it. I kept trying to rationalize what I was seeing, telling myself that weddings create emotional distractions and that people naturally move between conversations without realizing how they appear from the outside. But as I stood there adjusting small details of my dress and watching the flow of movement in the room, I became increasingly aware that what I was observing was not random behavior but a consistent pattern of preference that was unfolding in real time. Jessica appeared calm and confident, moving through conversations with ease, while I found myself increasingly focused on small details that others seemed to ignore. The way my father positioned himself when speaking, the way his attention followed her voice slightly more quickly than mine, and the way he seemed to anticipate her presence in group interactions all created a growing sense of emotional displacement that I struggled to articulate internally. There was no argument, no confrontation, and no direct exclusion, yet the experience of being in the same space felt increasingly uneven. As the ceremony preparations continued, I noticed that guests were beginning to gather in their seats, and the environment shifted from preparation to anticipation. That transition made everything feel more permanent, as if whatever emotional structure existed in that moment would soon be carried into the ceremony itself. I remember standing briefly alone near the entrance to the ceremony area, watching people settle and hearing the subtle sounds of movement and conversation around me. In that moment of stillness, the pattern I had been sensing became harder to dismiss. It was not about a single action or statement, but about repetition and consistency in behavior that pointed toward an unspoken hierarchy within my own family dynamic. My father's attention toward Jessica did not appear forced or intentional in a negative sense, which made it even more difficult to process, because it felt natural to everyone except me. That realization created a quiet internal tension, where I began questioning whether I was interpreting things correctly or whether I was simply reacting too strongly on a day that was already emotionally intense. But even as I tried to step back from those thoughts, the evidence I was observing remained unchanged. Every interaction I witnessed continued to reinforce the same imbalance, and as the ceremony drew closer, I began to understand that whatever was happening was not going to resolve itself through time or distraction. It was already forming into something structured, something that would define how this moment would be remembered, whether or not anyone chose to acknowledge it directly. As the final moments before the ceremony approached, I began to understand that what I was experiencing was no longer a series of subtle impressions or isolated emotional observations, but a consistent structure of behavior that was shaping itself more clearly with every passing minute. My name is Emily Carter, and I remember standing just outside the ceremony entrance, watching the final guests settle into their seats while the atmosphere shifted into a state of quiet anticipation that made every small detail feel more significant than before. My father, Robert Carter, was still nearby, and although there was nothing openly dramatic in his actions, the pattern I had noticed earlier continued with a quiet consistency that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. His attention still gravitated more naturally toward Jessica Carter, my sister, especially in moments when multiple people were speaking or moving at once. It was not a single action that defined the feeling, but the repetition of small choices that gradually revealed a sense of preference that I could not unsee once I had fully recognized it. I remember adjusting my posture and focusing on the ceremony space ahead, trying to center myself in what was supposed to be one of the most important moments of my life, but even as I did so, I could still feel the emotional imbalance in the way my family presence was being distributed within the environment. Jessica appeared composed and fully at ease, moving through conversations with an effortless familiarity that seemed to align naturally. With my father's attention, while I found myself increasingly aware of the moments where I was present but not fully anchored within the same emotional space. There was no argument, no confrontation, and no explicit rejection, yet the feeling of displacement became more pronounced because it existed entirely through behavior rather than words. As the coordinator signaled that the ceremony would begin soon, the environment shifted again, and the subtle noise of preparation began to settle into silence. That transition made everything feel more permanent, as if the emotional patterns that had been forming throughout the morning were now being locked into place as part of the memory of this day. I remember glancing toward my father once more and noticing how his body orientation, his pauses in conversation, and the timing of his responses continued to reflect the same underlying alignment I had been sensing since the beginning of the day. It was not something that could be easily pointed to or challenged in the moment, which made it even more difficult to process internally, because it existed entirely within patterns of attention rather than explicit statements. He began to feel a growing sense of internal distance, not from the ceremony itself, but from the realization that the emotional structure of my family's presence within this moment was not distributed equally, even though no one was acknowledging it openly. As I stood there waiting for the ceremony to begin, I became increasingly aware that what was unfolding was not just a wedding day, but a convergence of long-standing relational dynamics that were now becoming visible under the pressure of the moment. And even though I had not yet fully understood where this realization would lead, I could already sense that something in the foundation of how I understood my place within my own family was beginning to shift in a way that could not be reversed simply by proceeding with the ceremony as planned. As the ceremony was finally about to begin, I found myself standing in a space that felt suspended between expectation and realization, where every second carried more emotional weight than I had anticipated when the day first started. My name is Emily Carter, and I remember the moment the seating area grew quiet, signaling that the transition from preparation to ceremony was complete, even though internally I felt as if I was still trying to reconcile what I had been observing throughout the morning. My father, Robert Carter, stood not far from me, and Jessica Carter, my sister, remained in his proximity in a way that still felt naturally aligned, as if their interaction patterns had been established long before this day and were simply continuing without interruption. The imbalance I had been sensing earlier did not disappear as the ceremony began. Instead, it became more noticeable because the environment itself had become still enough for subtle dynamics to stand out more clearly. Guests settled into silence, the officiant prepared to begin speaking, and I could feel the weight of attention gradually centering on the altar area. Yet within that collective focus I remained aware of the smaller, more personal dynamics unfolding just a few steps away from me. My father's positioning continued to reflect the same preference patterns I had noticed earlier, subtle but consistent, shaping the way he oriented himself between me and my sister without any need for direct explanation. There was no verbal confrontation, no explicit decision announced, but the structure of attention remained uneven in a way that I could no longer mentally separate from what was happening in real time. As I stood there, I tried to focus on the significance of the ceremony itself, reminding myself that this moment was meant to represent a new beginning, but I found it increasingly difficult to ignore the emotional context that had formed around it since the morning. The presence of Jessica beside my father during key transitional moments felt less like coincidence and more like a continuation of a pattern that had been unfolding long before the ceremony began, and that realization created a quiet internal shift that I could not fully suppress. The atmosphere in the venue was calm and formal, with soft lighting and carefully arranged decor designed to emphasize unity and celebration, yet beneath that visual structure I was experiencing a very different layer of awareness that centered entirely on relational positioning within my own family. I remember thinking that if someone outside this situation were observing closely, they might not immediately notice anything unusual, because nothing overtly inappropriate was happening, but the meaning of what I was seeing was not contained in individual actions alone, it was contained in repetition and consistency across multiple moments. As the officiant prepared to begin the opening remarks, I became aware that I was no longer simply waiting for the ceremony to start, but instead mentally tracking the final moments before something irreversible would take shape in memory. My father's attention shifted once again toward Jessica in a brief exchange that appeared ordinary on the surface, but in the context of everything I had observed, it reinforced the same underlying structure I had been piecing together throughout the day. He stood still, aware that the ceremony would proceed regardless of what I was processing internally, and that realization created a separation between external events and internal understanding that felt increasingly difficult to bridge. In that moment, I began to recognize that what was unfolding was not just the beginning of a marriage ceremony, but also the culmination of a long-standing emotional pattern that had become visible under the pressure of this day, and once that awareness fully formed, it was clear to me that the experience of this moment would not be defined solely by the ceremony itself, but by everything it was revealing about where I actually stood within my own family structure. As the ceremony progressed beyond its opening moments, I found myself standing in a space where external reality and internal perception began to diverge even more sharply, creating a sense that I was observing my own life from a slight distance rather than fully participating in it. My name is Emily Carter, and I remember hearing the officiant begin the formal structure of the ceremony, his voice calm and steady, guiding everyone through the expected progression of vows and commitments, while I remained increasingly aware of the emotional undercurrent that had been building since the start of the day. My father, Robert Carter, stood within my peripheral awareness, and although the ceremony itself required attention to be directed forward, I could still sense the continuing pattern of his attention when it shifted subtly between me and Jessica Carter, my sister. It was not disruptive in a visible sense, yet it remained consistent enough that I could no longer dismiss it as incidental behavior. Jessica appeared composed and appropriately engaged with the ceremony atmosphere, but the emotional alignment I had been noticing all morning between her and my father still seemed to exist beneath the surface of formal proceedings. As I stood in place, listening to the officiant speak about unity and commitment, I became increasingly aware that my internal experience of the moment was not fully aligned with the external expectations of celebration. There was a growing awareness that something within the family dynamic was continuing to unfold in parallel with the ceremony itself, even though no one was acknowledging it directly. I remember focusing on my breathing, trying to remain present in the formal structure of the moment, but my attention kept returning to the subtle relational signals that had defined the entire day up to this point. The way my father positioned himself, the way brief interactions were distributed, and the way certain moments of attention felt more naturally directed toward Jessica created a persistent internal contrast that I could not easily ignore. It was not about a single action or statement, but about the accumulation of small, consistent patterns that together formed a clear emotional narrative that was separate from the official narrative of the wedding. As the ceremony continued, I began to understand that what I was experiencing was not something that would resolve itself simply because the formal proceedings were underway. Instead, the structure of the ceremony seemed to coexist with another structure of meaning that had already been established earlier in the day. That parallel structure was not visible to everyone in the same way, but for me it had become increasingly difficult to separate from the moment itself. I remember feeling a quiet internal shift where the significance of the ceremony began to feel dual-layered, one layer belonging to the public ritual of marriage, and another belonging to the private recognition of family positioning that had been revealed through repeated subtle behavior. My father's presence remained steady, and Jessica's proximity to him continued to reflect the same alignment I had been observing, and although nothing overt disrupted the ceremony, the emotional interpretation of what I was seeing continued to evolve internally. As I listened to the officiant's words, I began to realize that the most defining aspect of this moment was not the ceremony itself, but the awareness that my understanding of my family's structure had already changed before the ceremony had even fully begun. That realization did not create a visible reaction, but it fundamentally altered how I was experiencing every second that followed. And as the ceremony moved forward, I became increasingly certain that what was unfolding in front of everyone else and what was unfolding within my perception were no longer identical experiences, but two separate narratives existing within the same space. As the ceremony moved deeper into its most formal and irreversible moments, I began to feel an even clearer separation forming between the external structure of the event and my internal understanding of everything that had led up to this point. My name is Emily Carter, and I remember standing at the altar area, hearing the officiant continue the ceremonial script that was meant to guide everyone through vows and symbolic commitments, while my awareness remained partially anchored in something else entirely. My father, Robert Carter, was still present within my line of sight, and although the ceremony demanded forward focus, I could still perceive the subtle continuation of the patterns I had been observing throughout the day. His attention, when divided between me and Jessica Carter, still carried the same uneven distribution that had gradually revealed itself since the morning, and by this stage it no longer felt like something I was uncertain about, but rather something that had become consistently observable across multiple moments. Jessica remained composed, positioned in a way that naturally aligned her with my father's presence, and although nothing about the ceremony itself was disrupted, the emotional structure underneath it continued to feel increasingly distinct from the formal narrative unfolding in front of the guests. I remember focusing on the officiant's words as he guided the ceremony forward, yet even as I did so, my attention kept returning to the relational dynamics that existed just beyond the formal structure of the event. It was not a distraction in the traditional sense, but rather an awareness that coexisted alongside the ceremony, forming a parallel layer of interpretation that I could no longer ignore or mentally separate from what was happening. As the vows were being prepared, I became more aware of how the environment itself seemed to hold two different realities at once, one visible and structured for everyone in attendance, and another constructed through repeated subtle patterns of attention that had been unfolding throughout the day. My father's positioning, his brief exchanges, and the consistent way his focus aligned more naturally with Jessica in key transitional moments all contributed to a growing internal clarity that what I had been sensing earlier was not situational fluctuation but a stable pattern that had carried through from preparation to ceremony without interruption. I remember feeling a quiet stillness within myself as I stood there, not because the moment lacked emotion, but because I was beginning to process that the emotional framework I had entered this day with was no longer fully aligned with what I was now understanding about my place within my family structure. The ceremony continued forward with its intended rhythm, and yet internally I was becoming more aware that I was no longer interpreting it solely through the lens of celebration, but also through the lens of recognition. Recognition that certain patterns of attention had been consistent, recognition that they had not changed even in the most significant moment of the day, and recognition that this consistency itself carried meaning that extended beyond the ceremony. I found myself observing without interruption, noticing how every movement and pause within the ceremony existed alongside an equally persistent awareness of the underlying relational structure that had revealed itself over time. And as the officiant continued speaking, I realized that what was unfolding was not a contradiction between two versions of reality, but the simultaneous existence of a public ceremony and a private understanding that could no longer be separated once it had fully formed in my perception. As the ceremony continued into its most emotionally significant stage, I found myself entering a mental state where the external proceedings and my internal interpretation no longer felt synchronized, even though I was physically present for every moment of the event. My name is Emily Carter, and I remember standing at the altar area as the officiant guided the ceremony forward, his voice steady and formal, directing attention toward the exchange of vows that was meant to symbolize unity and commitment. However, my awareness remained divided, because alongside the visible structure of the ceremony, I continued to process everything I had observed throughout the day regarding my father, Robert Carter, and the consistent pattern of his attention toward Jessica Carter, my sister. By this stage, the pattern was no longer something I was trying to interpret or question, but something that had already established itself through repetition across multiple moments without variation. Even during the most structured and symbolic part of the ceremony, I could still sense how his positioning and attention distribution reflected the same underlying alignment I had been noticing since the beginning of the day. There was no disruption in the ceremony itself, no outward conflict or interruption. Yet internally I was experiencing a continuous awareness of a second layer of meaning that existed alongside the formal narrative being presented to everyone else. As the officiant spoke about commitment and future unity, I became increasingly aware that my understanding of those concepts had begun to shift in response to everything I had observed within my own family structure throughout the day. It was not a sudden change, but a gradual realization that had been forming since the morning and had now reached a point where it could no longer remain passive in my perception. My father's presence remained steady within the environment, and Jessica's proximity to him continued to reflect the same consistent pattern of alignment that had been present from the preparation stage onward. I remember noticing how even in moments of stillness during the ceremony, the subtle relational positioning between them remained unchanged, reinforcing a sense of continuity that extended beyond any single interaction. At the same time, I became more aware of my own position within the structure of this moment, not as something being actively defined by words or actions in real time, but as something that had already been shaped through accumulated patterns of attention and behavior earlier in the day. The ceremony itself continued forward without interruption, and yet my experience of it was no longer singular in focus. Instead, it felt as though I was observing two parallel processes at once, one being the public ritual unfolding according to its intended structure, and the other being the ongoing recognition of relational dynamics that existed beneath the surface of that structure. As I stood there, I began to understand that the emotional weight of this moment was not coming from any single action within the ceremony, but from the convergence of everything I had observed up to this point, forming a coherent internal realization that was no longer dependent on external validation to remain clear. And as the officiant continued speaking, I recognized that this awareness had fundamentally changed how I was experiencing not only the ceremony itself, but also my understanding of where I stood within the family system that was present in this space. As the ceremony reached its most defining moment, I became fully aware that what I was experiencing was no longer simply a wedding unfolding in front of guests, but a convergence point where every subtle pattern I had observed throughout the day was now forming a complete internal understanding that I could not ignore. My name is Emily Carter, and I remember standing at the altar area as the officiant continued speaking, his voice calm and structured, guiding the ceremony toward its emotional and symbolic peak, while my awareness remained anchored in a deeper interpretation of everything happening around me. My father, Robert Carter, stood within the ceremonial space with the same composed posture he had maintained throughout the day, and yet the consistent pattern of his attention toward Jessica Carter, my sister, remained present even in this final stage of the ceremony. It was not something that shifted or changed under the weight of the moment. Instead, it continued with the same quiet consistency that had defined every previous interaction I had observed since the morning. At this point, I was no longer questioning whether the pattern existed, because it had already been confirmed repeatedly through behavior rather than words, and what remained was the understanding of what that pattern meant within the context of this day. As the officiant spoke about unity, commitment, and the future that was being publicly declared, I found myself processing those concepts through an entirely different internal framework than I had at the beginning of the ceremony. The idea of unity no longer felt like a single shared direction, but rather something that existed differently depending on where attention and emotional alignment had been consistently placed throughout the day. I remember noticing how my father's positioning in the space, his brief interactions, and the way he oriented himself in relation to Jessica continued to reflect the same underlying structure that had been present from the earliest moments of preparation. There was no interruption, no visible conflict, and no dramatic shift in behavior. Yet the absence of change itself became meaningful, because it confirmed the stability of the pattern I had been observing. As I stood there, I became increasingly aware that my role within this moment was no longer defined solely by the ceremony itself, but also by my recognition of the relational dynamics that existed beneath it. The ceremony continued forward in its expected sequence, but internally I was no longer experiencing it as a single unified narrative. Instead, I was processing it as two simultaneous realities, one being the formal public structure of the wedding, and the other being the consistent behavioral pattern that revealed how emotional attention had been distributed within my family throughout the day. My father's presence remained steady, and Jessica's alignment with him remained unchanged, and while no one acknowledged this explicitly, the consistency of it became more evident to me as the ceremony approached its conclusion. I remember feeling a quiet internal clarity forming, not based on any new event, but based on the accumulation of everything I had observed up to this point, which now felt complete in a way that no longer required further explanation. As the officiant continued his final words, I realized that what was unfolding in front of everyone else and what I was understanding internally were no longer identical experiences, and that this difference itself had become the most significant realization of the entire day. As the ceremony reached its final and most irreversible moment, I found myself fully aware that what was happening in front of everyone was no longer simply an emotional event, but the final convergence of every subtle pattern I had been observing throughout the entire day. My name is Emily Carter, and I remember standing at the altar area as the officiant moved toward the conclusion of the ceremony, his voice steady and formal, guiding the final declarations that were meant to mark the beginning of a new shared life. Yet internally, I was no longer experiencing this moment as a single unified narrative. Instead, I was processing it as two overlapping realities that had become impossible to separate. One reality was the public ceremony unfolding exactly as expected, with guests seated in silence, attention directed forward, and all formal elements of the event progressing in their intended order. The other reality was the consistent relational structure I had observed throughout the day, a structure defined not by spoken words but by the repetition of attention, positioning, and emotional alignment between my father, Robert Carter, and my sister, Jessica Carter. At this point, there was no longer any uncertainty in my perception of that pattern, because it had been confirmed repeatedly across every stage of the day, from preparation to ceremony. What remained was not discovery, but understanding. As the officiant reached the final portion of the ceremony, I became aware of how unchanged everything around me remained externally, even as my internal interpretation had shifted completely. My father stood in the same composed posture he had maintained throughout the ceremony, and Jessica remained positioned in a way that continued to reflect the same alignment I had been observing since the morning. Nothing about their behavior changed in response to the ceremony reaching its most significant point, and that consistency itself became the clearest confirmation of the structure I had come to recognize. I remember feeling a quiet stillness within myself, not emotional collapse or dramatic reaction, but a clear and stable awareness that something fundamental about my understanding of my place within this family had already changed before this moment had even reached its conclusion. As the final words of the ceremony were spoken, I found myself no longer waiting for an outcome or a shift, because I had already reached the understanding that the meaning of the day was not going to be defined by the ceremony itself, but by everything that had been revealed through consistent patterns of behavior leading up to it. My awareness of my father's attention, my sister's positioning, and the unchanged nature of those dynamics had formed a complete internal picture that no longer required further validation. In that moment, I realized that what most people would remember as a wedding ceremony was, for me, something entirely different. It was the moment when observation turned into recognition, and recognition turned into irreversible understanding. And as the ceremony reached its conclusion in front of everyone else, I understood that the most important shift had already happened quietly within me long before the final words were ever spoken.